Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a future that might be a lot closer than you think, a scenario that's grounded in some pretty serious scientific research.
Just think about it for a second. A world with no cancer, no Alzheimer's, no infections of any kind. A future where humanity has completely conquered illness. What would that world actually look like?
Now, on the surface, that sounds like an absolute utopia, right? The ultimate dream. But here's the thing. When you dig into the scientific literature, you find a whole series of profound and really unexpected challenges. So let's get into it.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this whole paradox down. We're going to look at 5 key areas that researchers have identified, starting with how our lives themselves would change, and then zooming out to how it would affect our entire society. All right, first up, how would getting rid of disease fundamentally reshape the human lifespan itself?
So this brings us to a really fascinating scientific concept called rectangularization of the survival curve. I know, it's a mouthful, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Picture a graph of human survival. Instead of the gentle downward slope we have now, where people pass away at all different ages, it becomes a long, flat line. Almost everyone lives a long, healthy life to an advanced age, and then there's a really steep drop-off. Mortality gets compressed into a tiny window, caused by things like accidents, not sickness.
And this really highlights a super important distinction. The difference between lifespan, which is just how many years you're alive, and health span, which is how many of those years you're actually in good health. You see, for most of history, medicine has just been about extending lifespan. But in this new world, the goal shifts completely to maximizing health span. The new normal would be a vibrant, active life, maybe for well over 100 years.
But, okay, this new reality immediately brings up a huge question. What happens when you have billions of super healthy people living for centuries, all on a planet with, limited resources?
Well, the ecological and demographic models on this are pretty terrifyingly clear. Unless there's a massive, and I mean massive, drop in birth rates to balance out the fact that almost no one is dying from disease, we would face an absolutely unprecedented population explosion. The math is simple, right? If the drain is plugged, the tub is going to overflow.
And that population boom would set off a whole cascade of crises. We are not talking about minor inconveniences here. We're talking about the potential for collapsing ecosystems, critical shortages of things we take for granted like fresh water, and intense global conflicts over the land and food needed to keep everyone alive.
So all this demographic pressure would, of course, completely warp our economies and the whole idea of what a career even is.
I mean, just try to wrap your head around that. The average person lives to be 150 years old, or even older. How on earth does our economic system adapt? The entire model of work for 40 years, then retire becomes completely, utterly obsolete.
And when you look at the economic forecasts, they split into 2 totally opposite camps. On one side, you have the longevity dividend theory. The argument there is that a healthy, super experienced workforce, maybe working until they're 90, could create a boom in productivity like we've never seen. But then, there's the retirement nightmare theory. This is the scenario where pension plans and social security systems just completely implode under the impossible weight of supporting people for retirements that last longer than their entire careers do today.
All right, so we've talked demographics, we've talked economics, but what about us? What would living a seemingly endless, healthy life do to our minds, to our psychology? This quote just absolutely nails the core psychological paradox. Think about it. If you have centuries of life ahead of you, any risk of accidental death, no matter how tiny, suddenly becomes catastrophic. You just have so much more to lose.
Seriously, ask yourself, would you still drive a car, or get on a plane, or even play a contact sport if one little mistake could rob you of hundreds of years of future life? Behavioral scientists think this could lead to a society that's incredibly risk-averse, stifling everything from innovation and exploration to just simple, everyday fun. After all, progress needs risk, and a society that's terrified of risk is one that could just stagnate.
And that stagnation wouldn't just be about inventing new things. Sociologists point to the social consequences too. What happens if the same generations hold all the positions of power, in politics, in business, in culture, for a century or more? How do new ideas, new perspectives, and necessary social changes ever get a foothold? Generational turnover is a huge driver of progress.
And that brings us to our final point. And honestly, it might be the toughest one to grapple with. Who would actually get access to these incredible life-extending cures?
Well, bioethicists warn that if these treatments are expensive, we could accidentally create the most profound, most extreme form of inequality in all of human history. This wouldn't be a gap in wealth or opportunity, it would be a biological chasm, literally dividing humanity into two separate species, the immortal rich and the mortal poor. The potential for global conflict in a world like that is, well, it's almost unimaginable.
And beyond that massive social justice issue, our very definition of liberty would be put to the test. We'd have to debate these incredibly difficult philosophical questions, like whether people should have a legal right to die if they just grow tired of a life that stretches on, seemingly forever.
So, after going through all these huge challenges, where does that leave us? What's the big picture here? The scientific consensus is pretty clear on this. Curing disease isn't the finish line for humanity's problems. It's really just the start of a brand new and maybe even more complex chapter. Our biggest challenges would shift from being biological to being strategic. The greatest threats wouldn't be germs or genes anymore, but our own economic systems, our social structures, and our ethical choices.
And that's really the ultimate question that all of this research leaves us with. It forces us to think way beyond the science lab and the hospital. It forces us to ask not just what science can do, but what we as a global society are truly prepared to handle.